My friends, I have bad news for you. There will be no happy ending for our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia in Velyka Novosilka, because Velyka Novosilka has fallen. This is how the Russian Marines of the Far East celebrated their victory.
Leave me alone!
And like the Storm Battalion wrote on their flag, "Будет только хуже." Translated in, "It will only get worse." So to fully understand what actually happened, we will go through a step-by-step analysis on both the operational and tactical levels. The Swiss article reported, "The Ukrainian defense lines are crumbling. Ukraine has suffered a painful defeat in southern Donbass. Critics accuse the high command of making catastrophic mistakes." Honestly, it's one of the most disastrous battles for Ukraine in a long time. All this mess could have been avoided had the Ukrainian command withdrawn its troops from Velyka Novosilka in time.
Madness. Madness and stupidity.
To me, the real tragedy is when I learned that it was the poor guys of the 110th Mechanized Brigade that were sacrificed. First in Avdiivka, where they had to battle out of an encirclement, and now sacrificed again to cover the retreat of the Ukrainian army in Velyka Novosilka out of another encirclement. But sadly this time, many of these guys were simply abandoned, left behind to their own fate. And it's not me saying it, it's Ukrainian soldiers themselves.
Боже, Велика Новосілка. Ситуація наступна. Нам всім тут пізда. Десь в 2-3 кварталах від нас, на призволяще. Ви кілька раз просили нас вивезти нахуй звідси. А нам кажуть, ні, нихуя, хлопці. Стійте до талого, блядь, це наказ. Ви, сука, нас чуть, блядь, в Авдіївці нахуй не згноїли, блядь. Але ви вирішили нас кончити тут, блядь, у Новосілці.
At night, some tried to escape from the cauldron in small groups, through enemy lines, but that's when they met a terrible storm of steel in the process. Sadly, these guys in the video that I showed you did not make it. During this battle, the Russian army launched some of the largest armored columns I have seen in a long time, completely overwhelming Ukrainian positions. But I don't understand! We were promised by the mainstream media that Russia had no more vehicles. If only there existed a tool that we could use to cut through this BS. If you're wondering how I keep up with all the political news related to the Ukraine war, it's because I use this app and website called Ground News for my research. I found this interesting story. Kremlin welcomes the possibility of a meeting between Trump and Putin. Ground News found nearly 100 articles covering this story. It immediately tells us that 42% of the sources lean politically on the right and 34% to the left, but that 70% of them are highly factual. As you can see, this is a great tool for my research. You can also access Ground News by using my link ground.news/HistoryLegends to access the Vantage plan. That's the one I use and they're offering 40% off right now. One of my favorite features of Ground News is the bias comparison tool. If you're in a rush, with one simple click, you can get a summary of what both the left and the right are reporting on for the same story. Here we learn that the left is emphasizing Trump's potential to end the war, while the center expresses skepticism about his rapid resolution claims. As for the right, it portrays Putin's openness to dialogue as favorable but shows Ukrainian officials dismissing this stance. Another feature that I like is the bias distribution tool that allows you to see the political leaning of various news sources. With Ground News, you can also filter through all these sources. Let's say I want an article that is politically at the center with high or very high factuality and no paywall so that I can read it easily. Perfect, we got 8 articles to choose from. Personally, as someone fascinated by warfare and geopolitics, Ground News is an invaluable tool that cuts through the noise. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. That's the one I use and it will only be available for a limited time. If you're already a subscriber, you can send Ground News as a gift for 40% off as well. So make sure you use my link in the description below. I think Ground News is doing important work and I hope you'll check them out. Not only will you support the headquarters, but you'll also support a small team looking to hold the media accountable. November 2024. Let's continue where we last left off at the end of November. As you can see on the map, the armed forces of Ukraine had 3 MSRs or main supply routes. to continue logistics operations in Velyka Novosilka. There was this one, the TO5-18 road, but now it was unusable due to the close proximity of enemy forces. Remained this one via Novyi Komar, and this one on the western side through Vremivka and Novosilka. Put simply, the big question for the Ukrainian command was whether enemy forces would attack from the front or thrust from behind. And it was actually a real dilemma. On the 29th of November, Russian forces closed in on the TO5-18 road and stormed the village of Razdolny. In this video, you can see a unique FPS experience of how Russian assault detachments of the 40th Marine Brigade cleared the settlement. The Ukrainians did send some reinforcements on the northern side of Razdolny, but it seems some of them were intercepted by Russian drones dropping grenades. Eventually, after a difficult battle, the village was secured by the Russian army. Here you can see soldiers of the 139th Russian Assault Battalion celebrating their victory in a joint effort with elements of the 40th Marine Brigade. And in this footage recorded right after the Battle of Razdolny, we can see Russian soldiers displaying all the enemy weapons and military equipment they captured from the Ukrainians. Further south, with Russian forces positioned in Staromayorsky, as well as in this farm complex. This 13-kilometer long salient south of Velyka Novosilka was at great risk of getting cut off. So we can think the Ukrainian command coordinated a step-by-step retrograde maneuver out of this cauldron. But the Russian army quickly picked up on the plan and tailed the Ukrainians. That's how on the 29th of November, the Russian 37th Motor Rifle Brigade pushed 3 kilometers along a 6-kilometer front, followed by another 2,700-meter push the following day. Yet, if we zoom in on one of these arrows, we see some trench defended by a Ukrainian soldier, all alone, against 2 Russian soldiers firing towards him from both sides. We don't know if this Ukrainian soldier survived, but in the footage we can see that he was covering the withdrawal of his entire squad, which nonetheless suffered some casualties by grenades dropped by Russian drones. East of Razdolny, this Russian unit of motorcyclists pushed along this countryside road towards the north, before being spotted and shelled by enemy forces. If we look at the map, they attempted an attack along this axis, towards the village of Razliv, but over the following weeks, no progress could be reported in this direction. December 2024. For the AFU, December started with the deep insertion of foreign elements. As you can see on the map, on December 1st, Russian forces advanced 4 kilometers. They crossed the TO5-18 road and continued all the way towards the village of Novyi Komar. In this drone footage, you can see the TO5-18 road and the village of Novyi Komar further in the back. During the assault, Russian drone operators harassed numerous Ukrainian vehicles and various pieces of equipment. Meanwhile, on the ground, you can see a vanguard composed of 4 Russian armored vehicles blasting at the village. The lead tank then makes a loop to its right in order to cover the entire maneuver, because moments later reinforcements arrived and a total of 7 armored vehicles then charged into the village. What you have to understand is that these assaults go extremely fast. It must actually be so terrifying for the defenders as they're pinned down by enemy shells, who are stuck in trenches, bunkers, basements. You don't know what's going on, enemies are everywhere, and all of a sudden they get swarmed and isolated by countless enemy rifle squads. And this reminds me of this following article I read on Ukrainska Pravda. The soldiers said that a typical Russian assault operation involves several groups of 4 to 6 individuals attacking Ukrainian positions from different directions. The most intense activity occurs at dawn, when reduced visibility due to fog or rain makes aerial reconnaissance more challenging. But of course, some Ukraine war commentators will simply call this meat waves attacks. Now, this Russian surprise attack was a game changer because it effectively cut 2 out of 3 MSRs for the Ukrainian garrison of Velyka Novosilka. Due to its strategic location, there were lots of back and forth, and heavy fighting continued in and around the village of Novyi Komar until the 3rd of December. As the Ukrainians carried out one drone strike after another on Russian units pushing inside the village, the Russians responded with their own fiber optics drones. Turns out Russian drone operators struck right into the bee's nest. The Ukrainian command gathered an armed fist and punched the Russians out of Novyi Komar by the 4th of December.
A shameful display! A unit is running from the battlefield!
In this video, you can see Ukrainian soldiers of the 48th Assault Battalion celebrating their victory after dislodging enemy forces from the village of Novyi Komar. This counterattack was a great success for Ukraine because it allowed them to reopen one of their vital MSRs. Now, as this battle was raging in the north, Russian forces made little to no progress around Velyka Novosilka proper. So during this time, Russian sappers played around with a wheeled explosive drone they call the Mole. I mean, to me it looks very similar to the German World War II Goliath. 80 years of development, back to square one! They also tried one of their NRTK Courier unmanned ground vehicles, bypassing minefields and anti-tank obstacles. This is what happens when you let gamers in charge of military operations. Put simply, they effed around and did nothing. Jokes aside, it's also because Velyka Novosilka was garrisoned by units of the Presidential Brigade, and the terrain that formed some sort of bottleneck was greatly advantageous to the defender. Thus, a Russian frontal assault would have been suicidal. In the south, along the Makarivka river, Ukraine still held these 5 settlements that they snatched from the Russians during the 2023 counteroffensive: Vrymivka, Neskuchne, Starozheve, Blahodatne, and Makarivka. So the day the Russians got driven out of Novyi Komar, they launched a general assault on Blahodatne. They literally just shoved it in from all sides.
Surprise, motherfucker!
The Russians won a swift victory, and that's how men of the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade raised the white-blue-red flag on Blahodatne. Fun fact, the Russians called this village of Blahodatne Savkhoz Oktyabry, in honor of the October Revolution. But that's also where an incident happened. Although the footage was released on the 21st of December, it must have taken place shortly after the capture of Blahodatne. There, some Russian soldiers executed 5 soldiers of the Ukrainian 110th Mechanized Brigade. And then there was this other footage of another 2 Ukrainian soldiers being shot after they had surrendered. Honestly, this is disgraceful. And the worst is that it's counterproductive. Next time Ukrainian soldiers are surrounded, they will think twice before surrendering. On the 7th of December, Russian forces rammed enemy trench lines located between Rivnopil and Staromayorske and advanced 2,500 meters. Using this 3D map, we can see how the Russians are pushing along this plateau, which is overlooking all the villages along the Makarivka river. It's very dangerous because if they continue in this direction, all these Ukrainian troops in the valley will be effectively trapped.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
In one of these positions they captured, Russian soldiers were extremely impressed by the living standards in this Ukrainian bastion. So yes, it's true that many Ukrainian fortified positions are getting upgraded, they're getting better, but sadly there's nobody to defend them. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. The Russian command also launched another attack west of Velyka Novosilka, right in this direction, but it was stopped by men of the Ukrainian 31st Mechanized Brigade. As you can see in the following footage, the Russians pressed forward with small armored columns, which dropped fire teams into the tree lines. But an effective artillery barrage knocked out the Russian vehicles and stalled the entire operation. After that, there were no major territorial changes to be reported between the 7th and the 12th of December. But as you know by now, this is always a bad omen. It's not because the Russians are tired, it's because they're regrouping their forces for the next punch. In the north, after their success in Novyi Komar, Ukrainian troops tried to counterattack in Razdolne. It was also a strategic position, because if the Ukrainians managed to recapture the settlement, it would reopen these 2 main supply routes we talked about earlier. Instead of launching a massive counterattack, they started by inserting small recon units, just the tip of the spear, to test the mood, you know. Most recon teams went forward in teams of 3 to 4 scouts, but in this case, the Ukrainian recon team was spotted and the Russian Senator vehicle was destroyed. The 13th of December was a dark day for Ukraine, as Russian assault detachments attacked from all sides. In a coordinated maneuver, they swarmed Ukrainian positions from Blahodatne, Staromayorske, as well as across these fields overlooking the river, thus trapping a number of Ukrainian units in the village of Makarivka. And as the Ukrainian command panicked and sent all available reserves to the south, that's when 2 days later, on the 15th of December, the Russians launched another major assault in the north against Novyi Komar. After a 3-kilometer charge, the Russians secured the southern part of the village, where they received a welcome party from Ukrainian drone operators. During this back and forth of Russian armored Uber rides, 5 out of 10 APCs and IVs were knocked out. And this attack was really devastating because it was perfectly coordinated with the one in the south. Russian storm battalions of the 60th Motor Rifle Brigade exploited the gap and pushed another 1,300 meters across fields, while scouts from this grouping in Blahodatne managed to cross over the Mokry River. As you can see in this Ukrainian drone footage, sabotage units and small teams of Russian riflemen dug in after having crossed the river. Meanwhile, a couple hours later at night, Russian snipers harassed Ukrainian soldiers that just got disembarked to reinforce the sector. I think you've understood that the situation in this sector was extremely critical. With this latest Russian move, the Ukrainian garrison of Makarivka was effectively encircled. Or at least this is what the Deep State UA team reported according to their own intel. Meanwhile, the General Staff of Ukraine said this was complete nonsense, and that in reality Makarivka was not encircled and that everything was fine, and that there will be consequences for guys like that continuously misreport the situation at the front. Honestly, we don't know what happened in Makarivka. We will probably know in a few days or weeks. Anyway, 48 hours later, by the 17th of December, the Russians brought in additional reserves and tightened the noose around Makarivka. Uh-oh, big finger. If the map by Deep State UA is accurate, the situation was effectively catastrophic, as Russian forces around Blahodatne were about to link up with the forces pushing from the plateau. All the while, the first Russian infantry squads were already roaming around Makarivka proper. Meanwhile, east of Novyi Komar, the Russian commander in charge of this sector said, "Blyat, enough fucking around," and launched the biggest assault column I've seen in a while. As you can see in this spectacular footage, a column of 10 armored vehicles of the 40th Naval Brigade charged towards the village of Novyi Komar. They left from Razdolny and attacked precisely along this tree line. Without suffering any losses once inside the village, all these BMPs disembarked approximately 60 soldiers, 2 entire platoons, after which all the vehicles quickly returned to base. And that's why on the Deep State UA map, they added these 2 tree lines under Russian control. Once again, it all happened so fast that this time the Ukrainians had no time to respond. All they could do was to bombard Novyi Komar with the infamous Caesar cannons of the French-trained 155th Mechanized Brigade.
Fire!
Since they had no reserves readily available, they could not counterattack and dislodge this new wave of Russian troops. That's when Russian army units officialized the capture of Novyi Komar. By the 21st of December, it was GG well played for the Ukrainian defenders of Makarivka. That's right, the 2 tips touched. This Ukrainian grouping was effectively surrounded. By the 23rd, the orcs mopped up all of Makarivka and captured Starozheve in the process. That's how men of the 60th Motor Rifle Brigade raised their banner on Makarivka, as well as on the settlement of Starozheve. A couple kilometers to the west, the Russians also cleared this 9 square kilometer sector, taking hold of all these potato fields between Novodarivka and Rivnopil. After that, there were no major territorial changes to be reported up until the 27th of December, when the Russian grouping west of the Mokry River advanced another 1,000 meters towards Ukraine's last remaining supply road. Due to the importance of this sector, the Russian attack met stiff resistance. The Russian vehicles that progressed in this direction were systematically targeted and destroyed by enemy drones. 4 elements of the Russian army did manage to reach the road, but they were also quickly driven back by artillery and FPV strikes. As you can see, Ukrainian units depend entirely on drones to prevent enemy forces from breaking through their defensive perimeter. That's why in the following video, men of the 105th Territorial Defense Brigade are asking people for more equipment. January 2025. As you can see on the map, by January 1st, Velyka Novosilka was 3/4 encircled. The Russian army was effectively tightening the noose around the city. In this footage, you can see a Russian drone flying with a loudspeaker urging Ukrainian troops to surrender. In my opinion, this would have been the perfect moment for the Ukrainians to withdraw from Velyka Novosilka, because as Russian assault detachments were getting closer to the city, the Russian Air Force intervened to destroy key bridges used for all the logistics of the Ukrainian garrison using their infamous FAB bombs. For example, there was this bridge and this one, followed by this one as well. Meanwhile, drones targeted cameras and communication equipment scattered across the city. Part of the reason explaining Ukraine's difficulties in defense in the sector comes from Ukraine's poor management of its war industry. They pump out shells, but it's of low quality. In this video, a mortar crew of the Ukrainian 151st Mechanized Brigade is complaining about receiving 82mm shells with non-detonating fuses. That day, on January 1st, Russian forces pushed 900 meters along this tree line, and by the 3rd, they had advanced a little bit more here and there. This attack was supported by a storm of Uragan batteries, as well as by helicopters lobbing their missiles. But this one also nearly got struck by Ukrainian drones. Overall, by that point, we could have a better idea of the Russian battle plan. Pin down Ukrainian forces in Velyka Novosilka and flank them from the west along the high ground. This operation would cut off the last supply line of the Ukrainian garrison. However, honestly, even if that happened, there was some sort of plan B for the general staff. As you can see on the map, there was this little dirt road along the river that could still be utilized by the AFU. Overall, holding the outskirts village of Makarivka was of utmost importance. That's when I think the AFU started withdrawing all their heavy weapons, all their armored vehicles, and all the elite units to the west bank of the Mokriyeli River. But it took a couple days for the Russians to pick up on this maneuver. More on that in a minute. By the 7th of January, Russian assault detachments cleared this tree line as well as this one, and 3 days later, on the 10th, the Ukrainians abandoned all their combat positions in the area. This meant Russian forces controlled a 5-kilometer long tree line parallel to Ukraine's last MSR. They were only 900 meters away, or a little bit more than 8 football fields from their objective, which would also happen to seal the fate of Velyka Novosilka. For sure, the next Russian move was to be in this direction. From the perspective of the General Staff of Ukraine, it's not a coincidence that most elite units like the Presidential Brigade suddenly appeared outside Velyka Novosilka, towards the high ground west of the city. Not only has their fighting potential been preserved, but their role now was to prevent Russian forces from pressing forward on the flanks, and thus prevent a complete encirclement of Velyka Novosilka. Same story for the 48th Assault Battalion, which was urgently redeployed to prevent a river crossing operation north of the city. Meanwhile, the 110th Mechanized Brigade was to stay behind in Velyka Novosilka as a rearguard unit, which would slowly be repatriated towards friendly lines, if possible. That's when the Russians unleashed one of the most intense artillery preparations Velyka Novosilka had ever witnessed. Here, TOS-2s launched their thermobaric warheads on the city, shattering one building after another. In this Russian reportage, artillery crewmen explain how the TOS-2 has many improvements on the TOS-1 Saltsepyok. Overall, they claim that it's more maneuverable, which then allows the vehicle to leave firing positions faster and avoid being detected. Meanwhile, Russian storm detachments got a morale boost by testing their riz on some reporters. On the 11th of January, after 2 weeks of rest, the 40th Naval Brigade from the Far East pushed 1,000 meters between Novyi Komar and Velyka Novosilka. 2 days later, the Russian Marines advanced another 300 meters inside Novyi Komar. Yeah, I know they celebrated their victory a couple weeks ago, but now it's legit. With the increasing artillery bombardment and the approaching enemy forces, the Ukrainian garrison could feel that the end was near. The last defenders of Velyka Novosilka anxiously waited in their dugouts for the final assault. On that same day, January 13th, something totally unexpected happened. Some Russian troops were spotted 2 kilometers beyond the contact line, took position inside a high school, and secured this entire area north of Neskuchne. At first, I thought the Russians just used their typical brute force tactic and launched massive armored columns in this direction. But no, this time they did something more creative. Apparently, under the morning fog, Russian assault detachments used rubber boats and rafts to cross the Mokry River and take hold of several key positions inside the village. As you can imagine, that completely shocked the defenders. All of a sudden they thought they were entirely surrounded. This is what the commander of the Storm Battalion that led this operation said in an interview.
Во время тумана зашли быстро. Военнослужащие знали свою задачу, отработали. Противник не ожидал столь стремительных и быстрых действий. Противник находился на своих огневых позициях. Застали их врасплох. То есть, грубо говоря, при штурме расчеты пулеметов не успели даже подойти к своим пулеметам.
The remaining Ukrainian strongholds were heavily bombarded. They were pounded like no tomorrow, as Russian howitzers unleashed one load after another. Meanwhile, Russian reinforcements hastily concentrated towards the settlement. It's the second wave that mopped up Neskuchne, whose capture was officialized by Deep State UA on the 15th of January. That's when Russian forces raised their flag on the village. Since the village was now entirely in ruins, a lot of the medevac operations had to be carried out on foot. But this time, this Russian group of medics was intercepted by Ukrainian drone operators. The capture of Neskuchne was immediately followed by the assault of the 394th Motor Rifle Regiment against Vremivka, which fell almost instantly. Once again, the attack was preceded by a storm of steel, plus wave after wave of drones. In this footage, you can see the work of Russian storm detachments clearing one building after another. And I wanted you to look at their heavy usage of grenades. It actually reminds me from this scene from Les Croix de Bois, where French soldiers during World War I storm a village, and the first wave of soldiers is only equipped with a pouch full of grenades that they throw one after another. The Russian attack was so swift that many Ukrainian units simply fled or found themselves surrounded. For example, in this video we see Russian scouts showcasing all the enemy equipment that was left behind, such as anti-tank weapons and machine guns. That's also when Russian artillerymen replaced their explosive charges for pamphlets, trying to convince the remaining Ukrainian pockets to surrender. Apparently it worked. They stated that up to one platoon, so 30 to 40 men, had actually laid down their weapons and surrendered. Hold on a second! Okay, let's zoom in real quick. Sneaky Ruskies! This was not the real area of control of Russian forces. This is what they printed on the pamphlet, and this was the real situation. During the Battle of Vremivka, the Russians reported 70 enemy soldiers KIA. If this figure is true, and we add all the wounded, let's say a 3-to-1 ratio, plus the soldiers that were possibly captured, and the ones that escaped, it means an entire Ukrainian battalion was annihilated in essentially one day of battle. In the end, that's how the 394th Regiment of the 127th Division raised the Russian flag on Vremivka, right in front of the bridge looking over the Mokry River. On the other side, it was Velyka Novosilka. This was highly symbolic because the Russian army had effectively undone all the gains the Ukrainians achieved in the sector during the 2023 summer counteroffensive.
I'm thinking I'm back!
In my opinion, this operation is the result of some intelligence work when the Russian commands noticed that the Ukrainians were slowly withdrawing from Velyka Novosilka, and that's when the Russians decided to strike. At this point, it became clear, l'étau se resserre. The noose was tightening. Velyka Novosilka was effectively in an operational encirclement. All three supply routes were cut off, and not a single bridge was left standing between Ukrainian lines and the garrison. Even that little dirt road could not be used anymore. Even worse, 3 rivers crossed Velyka Novosilka and chopped up the city in multiple parts that could hardly mutually support one another. That's when panic struck and droves of Ukrainian units started making their way northwards out of the cauldron. Since it was winter, part of the river could easily be crossed by foot. For example, in this video, you can see about 15 Ukrainian soldiers trying to escape at night. They're met with an intense artillery barrage. From the Russian perspective, the question was how to storm the city. One option was from Vremivka, but there was a river to cross and all the bridges were destroyed. Another option was for the grouping Novyi Komar to strike the northeastern part of town and cut off the retreat of the Ukrainian garrison. But in this scenario, there was yet another river to cross. Same situation for an attack from the south. The only way to enter Velyka Novosilka without being bothered by bridges would be by the southeast along this 1 kilometer wide alleyway, and from there push right into the city center. On the 18th of January, Russian forces closed the gap both in the north and the south after a 2.3 kilometer push along the TO5-18 road. Deep State UA stated that it was a Russian column of 13 armored vehicles that charged brute force tactic right into the eastern part of Velyka Novosilka. Despite the best efforts of Ukrainian drone operators, 6 of these BMPs reached their destination, which then disembarked the equivalent of an entire assault platoon. 24 hours later, in this video, we see a slightly elevated part of the city being heavily bombarded by TOS-1 Saltsepyok. This sector was geolocated right here on the map. Surprise, surprise, the next day, on the 20th of January, the Russians attacked exactly from this direction, breaking through Ukrainian positions and swooping the buildings they shelled the previous day. By January 21st, Russian forces advanced on the east bank along Stepna Street and along Pershotravneva Street, named after the May 1st International Workers' Day. That's when the Ukraine command regrouped some forces near Dnipro-Energia to break the encirclement and evacuate the entire garrison. That's when they got harassed and swarmed by Russian FPV drones. As you can see, a number of vehicles, including a T-64 BV tank, were destroyed and left behind. So we can believe that instead of counterattacking Novyi Komar once again, these units were transferred to the northern bank of the Mokreyeli River to protect this crossing point, and perhaps even pick up stranded rifle units that did make it across. That's probably what happened to this BMP that was destroyed right next to the river. On January 22nd, Russian stormtroopers mopped up the entire southern side of the May 1st street. In this area, one squad of Ukrainian soldiers probably could not retreat, and instead of surrendering, they decided to fight until the end. There was a video of the aftermath. Obviously, I cannot show it to you, but yeah, those are things nobody should see. 24 hours later, assault detachments of the 5th Tank Brigade launched a massive armored column right into the heart of the city, disembarking dozens of rifle squads. These assault detachments can be seen clearing this residential sector, and that's how on the 24th of January, the Storm Battalion of the 5th Brigade took control of the city center, where they raised their skull and black banner with the words "Будет только хуже" written on it, translated into "It will only get worse." As you can see, this latest Russian attack sealed the fate of the Ukrainian garrison of Velyka Novosilka. All these Ukrainian soldiers that were still stuck south of the Shaitanka River, they're surrounded. As for the ones in the north, it was only a matter of time before they get crushed. The Ukrainian commanders of the Khartitsia operational group had effectively written off their troops south of the Shaitanka River. Nothing could be done and they would just be sacrificed.
Отже, Велика Новосілка. Ситуація наступна. Нам всім тут пизда. Підори десь в 2-3 кварталах від нас. А дірка на вихід з цього очка дедалі менше та менше. А все через те, що йобана фортеця, гондони йобані, блядь, кинули нас тут на призволяще. Ви кілька раз просили нас вивезти нахуй звідси. А нам кажуть, ні, нихуя, хлопці, стійте до талого, блядь, це наказ. Сука, ви гондони йобані, фортеця, ви слышите? Блядь.
Ось як отримувати нагороди, так це фортеця. А як пизди відплатувати, погибнути, так це 110-та.
Ви, сука, нас чуть, блядь, в Авдіївці нахуй не згноїли, блядь. Благо нам повезло, ми, блядь, з того оточення нахуй з'їбались. Але ви вирішили нас кончити тут, блядь, у Новосілці. Наші смерти будуть нахуй на вашій совісті, блядь.
The next day, on the 24th of January, small groups of Ukrainian soldiers attempted to flee to the north on their own through enemy lines. The units that did not get intercepted suffered the wrath of the Russian artillery. A couple hours later, Russian storm detachments cleared this sector and raised their banner on the southern part of the city. On the 25th of January 2025, Velyka Novosilka had officially fallen into Russian hands, with its troops celebrating their victory and with trucks full of prisoners going back to the rear. In the coming weeks, we can expect the Russian army to rest as they transform the city into a large logistics hub, from where they will be able to continue offensive operations along the Mokry River. We can believe that one of their objectives will be the village of Komar, located 11 kilometers from the contact line. The settlement is strategic because it controls 3 crossing points over the Mokry River and would allow Russian forces to bypass all the Ukrainian lines of fortifications located north of Velyka Novosilka. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.